again to everyone. Oh, Jane, I think you're breaking up a little bit for me, but okay. Can everybody hear me at this point? You feel free to put in the chat function if everybody can hear me. So I'm going to share, perfect. I'm going to share my screen in just a second. But as Jane mentioned, this session is about engaging low-income caregivers, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of caregivers in general and kind of the broadness of that term. But I've got the chat function pulled up, and so feel free at any point, if you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to put those questions in the chat function at any point, and I will kind of answer them as we go. And then I will try to leave, I'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions as well, kind of more intentionally at the end. So I'm going to share my screen first, and then perfect. So for this presentation, we're going to learn a little bit more about low-income caregivers, and then we'll kind of go into some tactics to how, in terms of how to support low-income caregivers. So I've talked about the brain a good bit already today. It's generally one of my favorite things to talk about. But if you either attended the keynote or attended the breakout, some of these things are really a refresh, if you will. But the brain is a social organ, as I've mentioned, so that means that we really thrive in community, and we have a biological need for community and belonging. When folks are living in poverty, and so living in a low-income environment, they have an increased amygdala, and their hippocampus, so their memory is impacted in terms of both short-term and long-term memory. And then there's an impact on the prefrontal cortex, which is really our conscious mind, and that's the part of our brain that helps us do things like plan, think into the future, that sort of thing. And so the connections, if you will, are less thick. And so when we're thinking about low-income caregivers, I want to kind of make sure we're kind of all on the same page about the group that we're talking about. So there are some caregivers for whom they have really lived in poverty and low-income scenario for much of their lives. So that's really what we're thinking about, generational poverty. So if you attended this morning, my family, my dad's side of the family, more specifically up until really my generation and my cousins, were all in poverty. I mean, his parents, his grandparents, everybody kind of lived in low-income communities. And so he lived in poverty from zero until, really 1920, kind of a scenario. He was in college, and then, kind of shifted from there. So there are those families, and for those adults, I mean, they have the long-term impact of poverty because they grew up living in a low-income environment, and then potentially as an adult as well. Then there are some folks for whom they didn't necessarily live in a low-income community or environment growing up, but they, for one reason or another, are now living in poverty. And so when we think about those, those folks, their brains are potentially different in the sense that if you grew up in a low-income environment, I mean, you've got all of these, you've got the increased amygdala, you've got the, impact on your prefrontal cortex. But if you have shifted into poverty as an adult, you may have some of these same things, but it may be a little bit different. Like if I cracked open your brain or, put some brain equipment on, you did an MRI, because you didn't have the development and living in poverty during most of that brain development. But I do, will in a second talk about chronic stress and the stress of being in poverty. So one of the things that I didn't really talk about before, but that I will say is that, and I think that, from much of what I've talked about, this is really clear, but living in poverty, doesn't make you a bad person. It's not, it is just a function of being, and currently, people kind of can move up and down the income ladder. And there's this concept of asset framing versus deficiency framing, and really being intentional about the way in which we talk about groups of people and utilizing assets and really working to talk about that group in a positive way, as opposed to really only focusing on deficiencies. And so, I try to, when I talk about folks who are living in poverty, try not to focus only on the bad things, but from a brain perspective, there are just some changes that we have to think about. So just kind of wanted to mention that on the onset. So living in poverty really for any extended amount of time can lead to living in stress, right? I mean, there are so many factors about being in a low-income environment that will make someone stressed, right? And an acute amount of stress, an increase in stress, when it's kind of short-lived is actually a good thing for our brains and body. It kind of jolts us a little bit. That stress means that our adrenaline is increasing, so our body kind of has what it needs to move forward. Our cortisol is increased again, which kind of helps the rest of our body do whatever we need to do to deal with that particular stressor. But when stress is consistent and lasts over an extended period of time, it becomes chronic stress. That is also sometimes referred to as toxic stress. Our brains can manage, can deal with an increased level of cortisol for a short amount of time, but when that is increased for too long, our brains and body can't manage, right? And it can lead to all sorts of things, which I'll talk about in just a second. So, living in poverty can lead to chronic stress. And then you're going to get some of these same, potentially, depending on the age of someone, some of these same impacts, because our brain is plastic, it's malleable regardless of our age. But you're also going to get a few other things that happen when someone is living in a chronic stress situation, which, lots of folks are living in chronically stressful situations, whether they live in poverty or not, quite frankly. But there are diminished social skills and social judgment. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I know that for me, when I'm stressed, I'm probably a little bit less patient, right? I'm probably a little bit less kind. The social piece, I may or may not be as focused on my relationships in terms of both spending time with people, and I may say some things that later on I'm not proud of because I'm essentially speaking for my amygdala. And that social piece, that social skills and judgment is so impactful in the long term because, as I've said over and over again, we are social beings. We need to be in community with other people. And so if I am chronically stressed and putting, stress on my relationships, that can have a detrimental long-term impact. Chronic stress can increase the likelihood of anxiety and depression. And then it can also lead to stress-related illnesses and disease. So that's things like cardiovascular issues, diabetes, that sort of thing, because of all of the kind of shifts in our neurotransmitters and just our body not being able to manage. And it can even lead to early death if we're in a chronic stress situation for a long enough amount of time. Right. So the caregivers that we are working with that are in chronically stressful situations, and that is not exclusive, obviously, to low-income caregivers. It is absolutely, in my opinion, can happen when folks are living in a low-income scenario. But if you've got, a family that you're working with, and one of the adults has a chronic illness, right? Or you've got a scenario where a child is really struggling with some sort of illness, and you can absolutely have some of these same things can happen, right? So when we're thinking about low-income caregivers, we just need to remember that they are dealing with a whole lot of stressors, right? So we know that for a lot of adults specifically who are living in low-income environments, they are more likely to be working in service work. That research comes from, and I'll pull it out and show it to you. If you work with young people in poverty, you've probably heard of this, but Eric Jensen, gosh, I love his work. He wrote this book, and I have read it and keep going back to it, called Teaching with Poverty in Mind. And he's got several other books, Teaching with the Brain in Mind, all kinds of things. But some of this research comes from him, and then just also other research that I've done on poverty and how that impacts the brain and that sort of thing. But we know that folks who are living in poverty, often from a statistical perspective, we know that they are less likely to have higher education beyond a high school diploma. And that shows up that is true in South Dakota as it is in other places, right? And so that means that their work opportunities it's a more limited list, right, of opportunities. And we know that folks who are living in low income communities are more likely to work service shift jobs, right? So utilizing the chat function, or this is a small enough group, take yourself off mute. When we think about parents and caregivers who are working in service shift jobs, they're in the service industry, they're working shift jobs, I want you to think about and share what does that mean for them, right? What are some of the things that they are either experiencing, or some of the things that we need to think about when we're, working with caregivers who are working in shift jobs. So again, take yourself off mute and share it, or just pop it in the chat function. Graveyard shifts, low pay, absolutely. Multiple jobs. Higher stress. Oh, this is higher stress when asking for time off. I mean, so much stress because it's not as simple, right? There's not, it's not a process. It's not, I don't necessarily know if I'm going to get paid. Students are needed at home for childcare. Difficulty with childcare, potentially not being able to have access to it, transportation to and from events. They're not at home when their kids are at home. Maybe no internet for online learning. I talked about that, I think, in the last one of these sessions, that, there's a potential for a lack of internet. Physically demanding. I mean, you all have basically shared, the list that I have. Oh, I'm gonna go back. There we go. I think I just have to press it once. I can't ever remember how I do these animations. Okay. So basically the list that you all shared is exactly what I had. Long hours, having to potentially work nights and weekends, a lack of benefits and time off. So both lacking it, but then also, as someone said, having higher stress when you need to ask for that time off, lack of childcare options, and then older kids potentially having responsibilities at home. I have run an after school, well, it used to be after school, but I've run a mentoring program on and off for probably the past 7 years. And for a while we did everything after school, but then we shifted because of transportation issues and because so many kiddos had to be home for things like watching siblings. And this can impact time with children because, to Heather's point, not home when the kids are home. And then the other thing that, that Emily mentioned that I think is really important is that it is oftentimes kind of service shift jobs is physically demanding work, right? I mean, you're on your feet, you're moving around. And so, when you're home, you're just really tired, physically very, very tired. So these are all really good things to consider. And, when we are thinking about both kind of engaging with low-income caregivers and how we are, we'll talk about that in the second part, but, how we are communicating, how we're, trying to engage caregivers in their kids' education. What does that look like? It looks very different, right? If I'm working nights and weekends, or, I sit on the school improvement council for one of our local schools and our meetings are at 7:30, that could present challenges. My mom is really involved in the PTA at my brother's school and their meetings are always during the middle of the workday, right? So just, all of these kinds of challenges. Lack of benefits, lack of time off. So there's just both this chronic stress that a lot of our caregivers are dealing with, but then there's also all of these other factors that are involved in work. So some things that we should know, these are just some quotes that I've pulled from, from both a quote and then kind of just some remarks. So the caregivers that we're working with, and this came from Eric Jensen, they tend to be overworked, overstressed, potentially authoritarian with their children, sometimes using this, same harsh disciplinary strategies used by their own parents. So this is not a blanket statement. No one group is all the same. No one group is monolithic, but there are, some research has suggested there are patterns, right? And that we know that folks who, particularly for, again, folks who've grown up in poverty and now are continuing to live in poverty, these things can be true, right? Low-income caregivers are often overwhelmed by the sense of powerlessness and the inability to cope. Yeah, I've worked alongside organizations and who, support folks who live in poverty and people who live in low-income communities, in various roles in my career. And there does oftentimes, it's like, it feels like the way that I sometimes describe it is, it just feels like there's one thing after another. Like once you check the one box and you deal with the one thing, there's always something on the other side. And it always just feels very overwhelming. And then sometimes just like a lack of ability to cope because everything feels so big and like can't get anything done. And as you all have already, really alluded to and mentioned, chronic stress can impact parenting. Even for parents who are not living in chronically stressful situations. When you are stressed out from work or you just got into a fight with your spouse or whatever the case may be, and you then have to, shift it and engage with your kid, oh my goodness, you're going to engage in a different way because you're stressed. And stress is going to impact all of us, but when it's chronic and it's all the time, then for some young people, they only know their parents and their caregivers as people who are experiencing stress. They unfortunately don't see them outside of that because it again is very chronic. So the reason that I can, am really intentional about trying to utilize the term caregivers instead of parents is because there are diverse family structures, and all of these different diverse family structures can live in chronically stressful situations, right? So there are LGBTQ plus families, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer families. And I pulled this from some website when I was doing some data. I've got the link in the slide, but where you all can't see it. But so there, in total, in South Dakota, there are 20,000 adults in the members of the LGBTQ community. And 3% of them are, 18 plus. And there are 29% of those adults are raising children, right? So it is a very real possibility that you may interact with a family who is, who both adults are members of the LGBTQ community. Families led by grandparents and or just other members of the family, right? Somebody else is parenting, is providing the day-to-day care for the child. Then there's also youth in foster care, right? And so youth in foster care are sometimes, as many of you know, are in group homes, right? And so they don't have that traditional, 1 or 2 parent situation because, they're in a group home. And so they have staff people that are there to support them, but not, somebody who is air quotes parenting them. Then sometimes absolutely, youth in foster care or in foster homes where there is potentially, there are adults there, but they're in all kinds of different situations. There are single parent homes. I mean, there are a lot of diverse family structures. And some of these diverse family structures kind of in and of themselves can create stress, right? Like being a single parent could potentially be a very stressful situation, right? Not every single parent is experiencing chronic stress, but they certainly can be, right? Youth in foster care, depending on the scenario that they're living in, it can be a stressful situation. A lot of the kiddos that I am working with who are living who are in foster care, probably 60 to 70% of them are living with another family member. Right. And so that family member is really stressed because they didn't anticipate having to have this extra child, right? They didn't anticipate their family member being in foster care. So they're really diverse family structures. And that's why it's really important to think, intentionally about the language that we use. So I'm going to read a few things from a book here. It's called What I Wish My Teacher Knew. I'm going to read just a few things from this book. I wish my teacher knew that my mom and dad are divorced and I am the middle of 5 kids. 5 out of the 7 are boys. I wish my teacher knew that my dad died this year and I feel more alone and disconnected from my peers than ever before. I wish my teacher knew that my mom got divorced 3 times. I wish my teacher knew that I got kicked out of the house because of my mom's girlfriend. And I know I don't have a relationship with my mom because of it. So this morning I talked about empathy, right? And there are so many students living in scenarios where they have a lot of baggage, right? I've talked about this in various situations. And most of the young people I know who are living in poverty, they don't necessarily always feel like it's baggage. They don't necessarily feel like it's this extra weight for them. But then there are situations where it is really clear even to them that, this is different, that, oh, well, I can't do this, or, where, for me, I know that their brains are different, right? So we've got all of these young people who are bringing things to school with them that we have to think about. And the thing that I want us to think about in the context of this presentation is that whatever they're bringing, potentially their caregivers, the adults in their lives, have something too that they're managing, right? Like, this one child who said, my mom got divorced 3 times. And then that mom has had to deal with 3 relationships that are no more, right? What does that look like for her? How did she show up in that, right? How is she showing up with her child, right? So again, just things for us to think about as we're thinking about low-income caregivers and adults. So, I want to talk about some strategies, real specifically, thinking about low-income caregivers. So first, it's going to feel like, oh, of course, this matters, but communication. And when we're thinking about low-income caregivers and even more broadly thinking about, those diverse family types, learning how those parents want to be communicated with. And I think even more now in the time, in times of COVID where things are just a little bit different, right? Because I think a lot of teachers I know send emails and or update their websites, their school websites, and that's how they, communicate to families. Well, if you've got a crop of families who don't have internet, who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't have access consistently to technology, that means it's much harder. You've got to think out of the box, but only updating your website just means you're not going to get to them, right? Communicating early and often. I remember, when I taught, they talked about this, but really, again, being intentional about our low-income caregivers, because what the research says is that for some of them, they didn't necessarily have a great relationship with the school environment, and they potentially, and again, not every low-income caregiver, but what the research tells me is that for a lot of them, they have experienced challenges with their student in terms of their student getting in trouble or having issues with grades. So this idea of just building the relationship so that they know when you're calling, it isn't only so that you can say that Braden's gotten in trouble, right? Or that you can say, well, he's failed this class, right? How often are you communicating just the random things, the good things that just wanted to make sure you know? And then really being intentional about getting to know their children so that when you are calling and you are reaching out, just to continue to focus on that relationship, even if you're sending a letter home, even if it's with a high school student, saying, Billy had a great day today, and we talked about Marvel, the thing he likes, whatever it is, right? But really, really focusing on communication. And I know every teacher I know is communicating with parents, right? That's clear. You're all going to do that. But being really thoughtful about communicating with low-income caregivers. And are you trying to make sure that you're communicating with them in a way that works for them? Are you trying to make sure that you're being intentional about communicating the beyond just the check of the boxes, right? I've communicated with them because I have to. Are you trying to build connection with the low-income caregivers? And Brené Brown defines connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. Do the low-income parents and caregivers that you work with, when they engage with you, do they feel seen, heard, and valued? Do they feel like they can talk to you without being judged because of their situation and or because of their child? Do they feel like you're on their team? Because that at the core of it is why we are communicating with them. Not just so that I can check a box, and not just so that I can say, well, your kid is failing this class and I need to tell you because the state tells me to. But am I actually really, really focusing on that connection, right? The next thing is building trust. And as I'm reading this, if there are some things that you've done to build connection, to build trust with some of your low-income caregivers, please pop that in the chat, because I think oftentimes, teachers learn so much from one another. But building trust is kind of the other side of the coin to connection. And building trust again with these the low-income caregivers and just families experiencing chronic stress. There's a video that I've put a link to in the resources tab that I created, and it's too long of a video to show in this presentation, but it's from Brené Brown, and she talks about what trust is. And she says that trust is built in small moments, right? That she describes trust as like marbles in a marble jar. And she says that, we can either put marbles in the marble jar, and the marbles are these small moments, or we can take marbles out of the marble jar. And some examples that she gives in this video that, I'll share, I think, two of the examples that she gives. One is about her and one is about her daughter, to kind of give you some, a concrete of this like trust in small moments thing. So she said that when her daughter plays soccer, and both her and her husband have parents who got divorced and remarried. So her kids just have a bunch of grandparents. And she said that both her and her child, her daughter, because she was talking to her about trust, both of them acknowledged that for her daughter's one of her teammates who she's friends with, and for Brené, one of her friends, remembered her, her grandparents' name and made a point to reach out and say, oh, hello to them. And she said that might not feel like a big deal, but there are a lot of grandparents, right? And so that little small moment of remembering Like for Brene, it was, somebody remembered my mom's name and said hello, right? That was this trust building small moment. Her daughter said that she asked her daughter, like, what does trust look like for you? What does that mean? She said that she was in, I think, elementary school at the time, that when there's, if the table at the in lunch, if all of the seats are filled, then one of her very good friends will kind of like scoot over and give her half of like a butt cheek seat, right? So they can like share this little seat together, the little round seat. And again, that's just this little moment, right? So trust being built in these very small moments. And so how can we be building trust with really all of our caregivers, but really, again, specifically with low-income caregivers? And Brene has this great definition of trust that I think is awesome, because, the way that she says it, and I certainly agree, is that we sometimes, trust is this big concept, but when somebody says, well, I don't trust you, or you've broken my trust, it's like, what does that mean? How, what did I do to break it? But then also, how do I build it back? Right? Trust is very, very nuanced. And so she's broken down trust into this acronym BRAVING. And I'm just going to read it and kind of talk through it, because I think when we're thinking about how we build trust with caregivers, let's really think about what this looks like. So the first one is boundaries. You respect my boundaries, and you kind of have boundaries, right? So, we are respecting one another's boundaries. And so in the context of working with caregivers, I mean, this can look like, having a boundary of, I don't email parents past X amount of time at night, right? Or saying, this parent has asked, I've reached out and said, how do you want to be communicated with? And they said, we really like notes home. And while that may not feel like a boundary, you can say, well, they've asked for this, so I'm going to do this thing, right? Reliability. You do what you say you're going to do, right? At work, this means staying aware of your competencies and limitations so you don't overpromise, and then, being able to deliver, right? So am I reliable with my low-income caregivers? Am I reliable with all my caregivers? Am I reliable with my kids? If I say, hey, I'm going to make sure that I send you an email this weekend to provide you an update on Billy, do I send the email? And if I don't, do I on Monday say, gosh, I'm so sorry, I got really busy, I apologize, here's that update, right? Do I at least acknowledge? But do I do what I say I'm gonna do, right? Accountability, you own your mistakes and you apologize and you fix it, right? Am I accountable to the caregivers that I am working with? Do they know that I am accountable for my actions? And if I, don't do the thing, or if I, whatever it is that I mess up on, do I acknowledge it and apologize? The vault, not sharing information or experiences that are not yours to share, right? And keeping confidential things confidential. If a parent shares something with you and, because of your relationship with them and because you trust them, information that doesn't have to be shared with the rest of the school. Are you going around and just, telling, your other teacher friends, gosh, this, such and such parents told me this thing, right? Can you believe it? Do they know that you can, that they can trust you to not share information that isn't yours to share? Integrity is choosing courage over comfort. We talked about this, I think, in courage, right? But choosing what's right over what's fast, easy, or fun, and then choosing to practice your values instead of simply profess them. Do they know that you have integrity, right? That you're going to do what's right instead of what's easy, right? Because it's easy, to be honest, like as some, when I was an educator, it's easy to not necessarily like put in more effort with some of our parents and others, because there's so many things that you have to do as an educator that it's easy just to say, this is how I communicate with parents and that's it. And if you don't communicate that way, I'm sorry, right? Or to say, this is how many times I communicate with you and that's it. It takes more work. It's, it is not comfortable or easy to say, okay, I'm gonna post it on my website, but I know that these 10 parents, none of them have access to internet. So I've also got to print it out and, put it in an envelope and send it home with the kid, right? Are you doing that extra thing? Non-judgment, which certainly shows up a lot in terms of Brené's work, but, I'm withholding judgment, right? Which I think is really particularly true for working with caregivers who are stressed out. Because the reality is, if I am a stressed out caregiver, I'm probably going to miss something, right? I may miss something. I may drop the ball on something. You may have to call me 3 times for me to pick up because I'm busy and overwhelmed, right? Are you withholding judgment and assuming that people are doing the very best they can with what they have? And then generosity, are you extending the most generous interpretation? Am I assuming that people mean well? And am I assuming that, that if this mama isn't calling me back, it is not because she doesn't care about her kids' education or because she doesn't, care about me or the school, that, she's not picking up because of some other reason, right? Am I assuming, generous interpretation? So thinking about, your classroom, your work as an educator, how are you building trust with your caregivers? And then again, thinking very specifically with low-income caregivers, how are you building trust with this population of adults who are so intimately involved with the education of your students? Right? What are you doing, to create boundaries, to be reliable, to engage in accountability, that sort of thing. And then engaging caregivers in the education environment, right? And again, a whole lot of teachers already do this, right? We're putting out volunteer opportunities, we're, potentially sending things home that, that parents can talk to, but are we thinking through it? Are we doing these things with the lens of, okay, what if I am, a caregiver living in poverty? What if I am a caregiver who's doing this? Can I engage in this way, right? So are we thinking through what we sometimes call an equity lens, right? So how are we creating opportunities for caregivers to come into the school, right? Are we only having opportunities during one time of the day, right? Or are we saying, hey, feel free to come by from this time to this time, creating a window, right? Or saying on Mondays, you can come in at this time, but on Fridays, you can come in at this time, right? How are we allowing caregivers to come into the school? Are we thinking about, to somebody's point, transportation? Are we factoring that in to, and sometimes it's hard, right? If your school isn't on a bus line, then, and I'm thinking, buses here in Greenville, then it just may be challenging. But if you have an event somewhere else that is not in the school building, are you thinking about those extra challenges, right? For us, like when we're hosting events, are we thinking about, okay, well, this isn't on a bus line, so that's going to be really hard for this group of students who we know don't have access to transportation, right? Are we thinking about those things? And for us, like our bus line only runs like every hour an hour, and then it ends at a certain point. So like, am I ending events early enough for the people who I know are going to have to use the bus for them to even get back? Because if not, like they're going to have to leave early. So, thinking about those things. When I am publicizing volunteer opportunities, again, where and how am I publicizing that? Like if I know I've got a group of caregivers who, they want to volunteer in the school, they want to come in the school, but, they don't necessarily have access to internet, or they're not regularly checking, am I, also making sure that they are aware of those opportunities? Again, am I being intentional at the time of day when these things are happening, and just being thoughtful that, okay, can I create multiple opportunities for them to volunteer? What are the ways in which, are there volunteer opportunities that a parent can do from home? Are there ways that they can volunteer where you can send things home with the student, and then, the student brings things back, right? Can we think a little bit outside of the box to engage in caregivers in ways that work for them? Creating initiatives that will support families to guide their children's learning, right? So am I, if I'm teaching history this week, am I, do I have an extra 20 minutes, which I may not, but do I have an extra 20 minutes to kind of type up a quick summary of what we did for the week, and say, if you want to chat with your student, with your child about what we did, maybe ask them these 5 questions. Here's what we talked about. They ask your kid about this, right? So that they can really support their child's learning in a way that maybe works for them, right? That, that doesn't have to require, a lot of work for them to have to think. Because again, it's like if I'm working at a shift job, right? I'm already overworked. I may or may not have a lot of face time with my kid because of when I'm working. Let's make it easy for them and say, hey, here's what we did. Here are 2 or 3 questions to ask, right? So that they don't have to, ask the student what they did. And then goodness knows that students are not going to just give you a whole list of here's everything that I learned today, right? And then I've got to create the questions. So let's just support them in that way, so it's a little bit easier for them, right? Linking family and community engagement efforts to student learning. You know, how can I, you know, think out of the box? And I talked about this towards the end of the last presentation, but can I include, you know, culture and things happening in the community to whatever we're learning, right? So, you know, if I know that I've got, you know, in you all's sense, I've got a big population of American Indian students at my school. You know, how can I make sure that my teaching is culturally relevant, and that I am infusing things that, you know, that can really honor them and their culture into just my day-to-day interactions with students, into my learning, so that it really kind of links what they are doing, and it links, you know, this, you know, their family, their culture, their history into what we're learning, right? So I'd love to ask you all, utilizing the chat function, I'd love you to just share what are some things that you have done in the past to really kind of think outside of the box, if you will, to engage, you know, either low-income caregivers or just kind of in general, you know, that things that you've done to really try to engage adults in their students' education. And you can also just take yourself off mute as well, but feel free to utilize the chat function. And if you also are like, I don't know what I've never done it before, you can tell me that too. You can say, I don't know, that's why I came here. And I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second to make it a little bit easier for me to see the chat function on here. Most important information in a public space such as a laundromat. Love that, Donna. Love it. And so I'm gonna shift the question and ask a little bit of a different question at this point. What are things that, are there things that you are either, you know, towards the end of last year as you prepare for the fall, that you're thinking, I know that this is going to be a challenge. I know communicating this information is going to be a challenge. I know communicating with, you know, with this parent is, you know, is going to be a challenge. What are some of the challenges that you are anticipating? Sending things home and having it come back, not knowing the status of COVID in a home. Is it even safe to send papers home? You know, that is, I mean, that is such an important consideration that again, we wouldn't have had to consider before. And you know, that, you know, should we be doing things like, you know, and I don't even know, I mean, school budgets are hit in a pretty significant way, but, you know, should we be doing things like laminating things that we're sending home? There are, and I've got them over here, but, you know, the things that we can kind of utilize when we're putting things in notebooks. And I'm not good with, I don't know what they're called. So I'm moving only to get one so that I can share it with you. Sheet protectors, that's what they're called. You know, should we be getting sheet protectors and sending things home in them? Because, you know, and asking parents to keep them in here, you know, and then wiping the sheet protector down, because you're right. I mean, if a family has COVID, I mean, these are just considerations, and these are not crazy expensive from, you know, Staples, Office Depot, whatever. But, you know, sending things home in this kind of setting, you know, if it's just one sheet so you can look at both sides, and then just wiping it down. I mean, that's such a unique consideration to this time. Being able to connect with both students and families, especially if we're doing things virtually. And I mean, I don't know any adult, you know, anybody who's not thinking about that, because, you know, I don't know what the numbers look like in South Dakota, but I know in South Carolina, we had a whole bunch of students who we didn't get in touch with. Like, I mean, we stopped school because of COVID, and we don't know where they were, and we couldn't necessarily always do home visits. Like, we just literally didn't get a hold of them. And so I think we are going to have to get really creative and think some outside of the box and try to do some fun things, if you will, to engage students and families. And I'm kind of cheesy sometimes, so just go with me on some of these things. But should we do like a virtual game night for your families on Zoom, like, on a Tuesday night, say, hey, we're going to play some computer games? I don't really know. Again, I'm not super, I'm cheesy, but not always creative, right? So can you do some really fun outside of the box things, to engage caregivers? Let's do a Zoom thing. Let's, do like a fun phone thing, where parents can opt in, and it doesn't have to be, it can be, easy for them, doesn't require a lot of work, but allows you to engage both parents as well as children, right? I really like this idea of a game night. So somebody do that. I know that I have parents who aren't home with students if they do online learning. The parents are also tired once they get home and are frustrated trying to cover homework with the kids, right? Again, this challenge that, that everybody has, and the problem is, like, all of these things, there's no easy outcomes, right? They're what in organizational development world we call adaptive challenges, because they have no easy answer, right? Like, it's going to be hard to motivate some of our students to care, right? And what we all rely on is relationships. Like, most of us rely on relationships with students to get them to do stuff. Well, it's going to be awfully hard to build a relationship with students exclusively virtually. So we are going to have to really think outside of the box and try to, that first little bit of time, whether we're in person or virtual, really, really focus on like those social emotional learning pieces and the relationship, like, again, doing some cheesy out of the box stuff where you're trying to jumpstart, if you will, a relationship with your students, so that later on, when you are virtual and when they don't feel like doing the homework or when they don't feel like doing whatever it is, that you can kind of go back and rely on that relationship. And then again, trying to make it as easy as possible for parents, because you're right, like, whether they are working a 9 to 5 or they're working at, I have a friend who used to manage a Waffle House, whether they're working at the Waffle House or 9 to 5, they're tired either way, right? And so how can you support parents? And so maybe it is, sending, and it might be in the mail, it might have to be via Zoom or something, like, hey, here's what we're going to cover today. Here's a quick thing to ask your kid about, right? So still kind of doing some of those same things, but knowing that it's going to have to look very different. And then trying as much as we can, again, the language I'm going to use is hotwire a relationship with students, because if not, like, they're just going to struggle to connect, because for them, they know that if it's just on Zoom, they can check out. So what are some of the other both questions that you have about engaging caregivers and low-income caregivers, both in general and kind of now in the context of COVID, and or some additional challenges that you see happening, once school starts in just a few weeks here? I know as a offshoot of students not really being engaged is being concerned about just student motivation, because they've been, they haven't been in school for such a long time, that either students are going to be really, really, really excited about coming back to school in whatever format, or they're going to be not used to the structure of having to be in a normal school day. And I think that we will have to really think out of the box even more so. And one of the things too that I'll kind of throw out as a semi last thing here is trying to encourage your students and your caregivers to engage in meditation and mindfulness, because what we know is that low income adults and students and adults living in poverty have increased amygdalas. What we also know is that consistently meditating for 5 minutes a day for about 8 weeks will decrease the size of the amygdala. And so if we can be encouraging both young people and adults to engage in meditation, then that can help all of them, right? So, when we're getting on Zoom or whatever, the platform is with students, can at the beginning we say, hey, as every day we're going to meditate for 3 minutes. And there are a slew of apps and YouTube videos and all sorts of things that you can do with students. But it can It can, decrease the size of their amygdala, kind of calm their amygdala down. It can get oxygen to your prefrontal cortex and allow that piece of your brain to engage. So it really can prepare students to be ready essentially to learn. And then if we can also figure out how to infuse that into what we're doing with parents, right? Even if it, maybe you're sending something home about what meditation looks like, and, encouraging students to talk to their parents about, hey, can we meditate together? Then that is, you can, really benefit parents, particularly low-income parents. You can be helping their brain and helping them really kind of unwind and de-stress after what can be potentially a really stressful day. So that's another tip that I'm going to encourage is whenever you do go back to school, really encouraging students and your caregivers to try to engage in meditation. And you can model that by putting it as essentially a requirement of the day.